Good afternoon. I'm Julianne Brandon and I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Carey. It is my honour to open this special event today, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all attendees for what is traditionally our Carey 40+ reunion. As you are no doubt aware, here in Melbourne, our ability to host our usual reunion events these past 18 months has been somewhat challenged. However, it has given us the opportunity to be creative and innovative in bringing a range of online offerings to our Carey alumni. This approach has also had some silver linings this year, as we have seen attendance at many of our online events even higher than we normally would for our in-person events. Today we had up to 160 registrations for this event, so I welcome you all. In not being able to offer an in-person luncheon today, we have organised a very special guest speaker for you all. As you would be aware, Carey will soon be celebrating its centenary year in 2023. To help mark this milestone, back in 2019, Carey engaged a professional historian to research and write a history of Carey's first 100 years. The format for today will involve a very special presentation by our historian to provide you with some insights, a sneak peek, if you like, of the history book due for launch at our centenary launch celebration in 2023. This session is not interactive, so please enjoy a cuppa or a sandwich while you sit back and enjoy this very first look at what we can expect from the book. And this is a first. You are the first group to formally hear about this very important work. I now have the pleasure of introducing Helen Penrose of History Smiths, who since 2019 has been immersing herself in everything and all that is Carey's history. From 98 years worth of our Torch magazine, to old board meeting minutes, to records at the Baptist Union, Helen has read and researched it all, and has not only chronicled the most complete history that has ever been undertaken at the school, but has discovered some really wonderful stories along the way, some of which she will share with you today. By way of background, Helen has a master's degree in history from the University of Melbourne and has been a member and past president of the Professional Historians Association in Victoria. She has worked as a professional historian since 1993 and was a founding director of History Smiths in 1994. She has written histories about many different organisations, including hospitals, a law firm, a sewerage farm, and an agribusiness. But much of her work has been for schools, and she has written and co-authored 9 school histories, including other APS schools such as Melbourne Grammar, Caulfield Grammar, Ivanhoe Grammar, and the Geelong College. Since 2019, she has been working on the centenary history of Carey, and we eagerly await its publication in 2023. Helen has also become very much a part of the extended Carey family in her time here, and has developed many close connections throughout our wonderful community. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Helen.
Thank you very much, Julianne, for your wonderful introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. It's absolutely marvellous to be here. I'll just share my screen with you. And show you the first picture, which is where we're broadcasting, live streaming today from the very, very top of the UN room in the Philip Grutzner Centre for Learning and Innovation. For those of you who haven't been to the school for a little while, it's right next to the chapel. So the book is written, and this week I sent it to the copy editor. The illustrations are now being selected and the captions being written. Everything will be handed over to the book designer in December. It will take until around the middle of next year to do all the layout and design, the proofreading and the index, and then the files go to the printer to allow plenty of time for printers' proofs, printing, binding, shipping and delivery to Carey. So today, as Julianne said, I wanted to give you a secret look into the chapters, show you some of the artefacts and images I've chosen to illustrate them, and tell you other stories along the way about some of my favourite finds in the archives. I've promised you puppets, helicopters, Newnhams and Gallop poles, and these you shall have and more. So the first thing to say, now there's the bell. So whoever needs to get back to class needs to go off and do that now. So the book is thematic. It starts at the start, but it's not divided into chapters according to headmasters. Chapter 1 is contextual. It looks at Kew in the early 1920s just to set the scene. And I also set out historical reasons for why the Baptist Union of Victoria chose to open a school in Kew. Chapter 2 looks at how the school was founded, and in particular at the early generations of Baptist leaders and families who involved themselves in this great project. Laycocks, Mellors, Downings, Martins, Spicers, families from Baptist churches all over the state donated money, and after the school opened, they also donated goods. This was especially important during the 1930s. The school entered the Great Depression already on a fiscal cliff. People from Baptist churches in Kew, Canterbury, Ivanhoe and all around donated items needed in the boarding house, such as linen and towels and food. The Auburn Church once even donated 80 pounds of pumpkins it collected for the annual Harvest Festival. Many of the state's most influential Baptist leaders devoted themselves to the cause. People whose names are familiar to you: William Cartwright, Joseph Goebel, William Holdsworth and Alfred Fullard. Leonard Tranter, of course, is Carey's founder. He was the one who convinced the Baptist Union of Victoria to establish the school. And I will tell the full foundation story in the book. You'll just have to buy it and read it then. But for now, what I wanted to do was show you one of the most beautiful artefacts in the school archives. This is called an Illuminated Address, and it lives in the Mellor Museum. It uses calligraphy and hand colouring in the style of rich medieval manuscripts, which, when the monks who created them included illustrations and elaborate borders and designs, were known as illuminated manuscripts. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, it became quite fashionable for organisations to present illuminated addresses like this, which is encased in a thick protective leather cover, to very important people to thank them for their service. So the Baptist Union of Victoria had this illuminated address created for Leonard Tranter in 1924. And I think you'll all agree it's absolutely gorgeous. Another influential leader in Carey's establishment was Joseph Newnham. He served as minister of Ivanhoe Baptist Church from 1913 to 1922, and later at Kew Baptist Church from 1926 to 1941. The intervening years spent at Ontario in Canada had enlivened his evangelistic character and enabled him to witness the prominent place of Baptist education in that country, just as Leonard Tranter had done before him. During Joseph Newnham's ministry at Baptist Kew Church, it became one of the largest Baptist congregations in Australia. He was a member of the Baptist Secondary Schools Committee from 1920, which set up the school, and then of the council from 1927 to 1942. Joseph Newnham also served twice as BUV president in the 1930s. So why have I singled him out? Because I discovered that he is my relative, and here is a family tree to share with you. Joseph Newnham is there on the left-hand side, just down from in the middle of the page. His cousin, Madge Newnham, was also my cousin. You see me down there at the very bottom right-hand corner of the page. So we're connected by marriage through the Adams and Penrose families of the Nagambie area in the Victoria's Goulburn Valley. So it makes us cousins, but it's 3 times removed. Nevertheless, I recognised the Newman family name soon after I commenced my research at the school. I thought, I wonder, because as a little girl, I remember visiting Madge Newnham, who we called Auntie Madge, at her home, which I think from memory was in Canterbury or Camberwell or somewhere nearby. So my heart's affiliation at Carey is therefore to Newnham House, and even though this project is nearly finished, I'm delighted that I'll forever be connected to the school in this way. And here's the fabulous Newman House shield, which I also loved because my favourite colour is purple. So this story demonstrates to me one of the intrinsic and enduring characteristics of Carey, its community, bound originally by ties to the church, then to each other in what remained a small school until APS entry in 1957. To families in and around Kew, Hawthorn, Balwyn, Camberwell, Canterbury, Ivanhoe, Mont Albert and Surrey Hills in particular. And since then, through the flame of community connection, intermarriage and the handing on of the torch of the community's values of service and loyalty. Chapter 3 is about the school's developing resilience during the 1930s and 1940s in response to financial constraint and a tiny enrolment, and how the curriculum responded to the students' needs and began to develop its particular strength in science. So here's an illustration to demonstrate just how small the school was. This is from 1938, with every single boy from the preparatory school and senior school. Along the way, the school also had to close for a short time in 1937 to test its resilience too, and that was during the polio epidemic. Many annual school events were cancelled. Does it sound familiar? To keep Carey afloat financially, parents' associations did a lot of work in the 1930s. They ran fetes, for example, like this one in 1939. The Carey 1000, the monster fete in 1939 in March. Novel attractions included Aunt Sally, darts, puppet shows, shooting gallery, sheep lifting, antique exhibition, a hobby school, and cake weight guessing. The other thing the school council did during the 1930s was it blitzed Baptist churches with publicity campaigns. Teacher Cecil Shinkfield even took a touring party of boys around the state in their school holidays in 1934 to try to boost enrolments. They performed in the choir and in short plays at Castlemaine, Bendigo, Rochester, Wangaratta, Wodonga and Benalla. One of the treasures in the archives is the photograph album from that tour, and I will be putting a photograph from that album into the book, but I can't show it to you today. Another special item from the 1930s is a tiny notebook kept by school council treasurer Abia Neville. Now the picture on your screen is much, much bigger than the actual size of the book, which I would say would have been about 2 inches wide and maybe at the most 4 inches tall. In it, he recorded basic Carey data from 1923 to 1935, as you can see, enrolments, salaries, cost of buildings, annual losses, and the accumulated total by 1935, which was over £11,000, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but it was an enormous sum then. Although we have this information elsewhere, of course, in the school council records, for example, it is a much more personal and exciting experience as a researcher to hold this tiny notebook in my hand and to see his handwriting. Chapter 4 is about World War II and Vivian Francis's 3-year period as headmaster. Now, the manner of his departure was controversial at the time and led to historical amnesia about his important contribution to the school. So I will address all of that in the book. For now, I just want to show you one of the best photographs discovered in the archives of the school cadets. Now, as you know, cadets only ran at the school from 1939 to 1948. This shows the boys at the school's rifle range in 1940. It's just an excellent picture. Chapter 5 looks at the school's Christian educators and their teachings from 1923 to 1964, so up until the end of Stuart Hickman's era as headmaster. People like James Bills, Hedley Sutton, John Morley, Harold Steele, Stuart Hickman, Norman Dobson, Ralph Cook, Russell Costello, John Sykes, Ken Lyle, Alan Wright and others all set the school's Christian tone. The Crusaders too was an important group, and despite the growing Anglican enrolment which overtook Baptists by 1950, some Baptist sensibilities around alcohol and dancing continued to influence Carey. Now this photograph I'm sure many of you have seen before. It hangs in the hall in Evangeline. Sitting in the middle in that front row are the school's first 4 teachers, some of whom I just mentioned. So on the left-hand side, we have very tall James Bills. Next to him is Harold Steele. Next to him is Helena Corkhill, who was in charge of the preparatory boys. And next to her is a very young Stuart Hickman. And some other people who I mentioned before as being very, very influential for the school's Christian tone is Alan Wright, of course, and here he is preaching. John Sykes, looking relaxed, sitting under a photograph of Bunny Gramlich on the wall, and the inimitable Russell Costello. Chapter 6 covers activities outside the classroom from 1923 to 1964, especially sport, cadets and scouts. Bunny Gramlich, who I know many of you knew, was on staff from 1929 to 1964 and coached many sports teams. This is an extraordinary, excellent photograph of him. Scouting was very strong at Carey in the 1940s and 1950s, replaced cadets and was much more popular. This photograph shows the cadet troop in 1953, lined up outside, as you can see, Laycock House, all dressed immaculately in their scouting uniforms. Chapter 7 and Chapter 8 look at the curriculum developments at Carey from the 1950s through to the 1980s. And here are some of the significant teachers who influenced the curriculum and the school generally during that period. So at the back, we have Brian Baird on the left. Standing next to him is Jerry Grimwade, then Peter Bucknell, Ken Lyle, and in the front, Alan Wright and Alan Smith. And it would have been taken possibly in the late 1960s, but certainly no later than about 1971. Here is another excellent photograph of an inside the classroom. This is Alan Rees teaching workshop techniques in the 1960s. He served as the science laboratory technician from 1959 until 2004. And as you probably remember, was an expert glassblower who made bespoke scientific equipment for the laboratories. And here he's teaching some of the boys some of his secrets. Chapter 9 is about buildings, places and spaces. This magnificent photograph of Evangeline was taken in about 1924. It shows the sweep of the original driveway, which was at the very corner of Rixon Street and Barkers Road until 1953, when the school's entrance was moved further up Barkers Road to where it is now. And here is the Mellor Library. Inside the library, it opened in 1971. And I've got a favourite anecdote about the library to share with you about Year 12 boys and 1972. Gerard Kramer was overseas for much of that year and left Arthur Sandel in charge. He gave permission for a pool table to be hired for their Year 12 common room. When he discovered that some boys were asking to work in the library, but in fact were playing pool instead, he threatened that the table would go if there was any more play during class time. And apparently there was, and so the pool table was removed. Now, this is another wonderful photograph of inside a classroom, which are quite difficult to find in my experience in school history writing. And this shows the chemistry laboratory in the 1960s. And look at all those bottles and tubes lined up, some of which probably Alan Rees may have made for the school. And here is the oval. in 1969, looking across at the back of Evangeline. And here is an aerial photograph of the school in 2002. And even though this is outside the era that all of you attended the school, I wanted to show you some of the things that I'll be including in the book. There'll be other aerial images of the school in different eras. There'll be plans of the layout of the queue with various buildings labelled, and also the Don Vale and Bulleen sites. And there'll also be some gorgeous hand-coloured architectural drawings. Chapter 10 covers the preparatory school from its foundation in 1925 until 1958, and Chapter 11 continues on from that to encompass the junior school queue from 1959, when Stuart Hickman placed Ken Lyle in charge. Now here is the first known photograph of the preparatory school, which was on Rixon Street. This was taken in 1925, and if you look very closely around the portico, around the front door, you can still see some scaffolding then, so it's just not quite finished. From the outset, the junior section of Carey established a reputation for inventive teaching. Marion Metcalfe, who was in charge from 1925 to 1951, picked up where Helena Corkill left off. She inspired her colleagues to adopt progressive teaching techniques, won admiration from parents, and continued to foster Carey's high reputation in the local community for its sound teaching and modern methods. She believed in developing the whole child socially, academically, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And this was to be achieved through physical movement, social participation, free self-expression, and creativity. And what could be a better illustration of creativity than this charming photograph of the production of Peter Pan in 1932. Marion Metcalfe continuously pressed school council for more space, extra classrooms, better facilities, and in 1936 encouraged the formation of a junior school mothers association to support her and their children's education, and it thrived from the moment it was established. Some teachers at different times took a year's leave without pay to travel to England to observe the latest techniques in primary teaching. After her trip there in 1933, teacher Nancy Shum returned with loads of books and other items for the children to enjoy. In 1937, Marion Metcalfe combined a holiday with a study tour. When she returned, she addressed the Parents Association meeting on English educational trends, noting the importance of things like drama to foster children's capacity for speaking and reading, music, and arts and crafts. She used puppetry, one of the skills she had learned in England, to great effect on her return, and she used to hold puppet shows for the children. So this is one of the other things that I promised you in my talk today, was puppets. These two gorgeous little hand-knitted Carey puppets were probably made by members of the Junior School Mothers Association. They were donated to the school by John Hammond, OCG 1976, who started at the school in 1964. So although these, of course, are not the puppets used by Marion Metcalfe in the 1930s, for me, they represent the topic beautifully. And they also represent the long and diligent involvement of parents' associations throughout all sections of the school since the 1920s. Now, Margaret Little taught at Carey for 3 years in the 1930s. Her aunt was Margaret Little, known as Greta, who founded Press Hill in 1931 in her home at 406 Barkers Road, exactly opposite Carey. Press Hill moved to new premises further up Barkers Road in 1937, and from 1939, Margaret Little taught there with her aunt and took over the running of Press Hill in 1944. I think it's very interesting that some of her formative years of teaching were spent in Carey's preparatory school under the direction of Marion Metcalfe. And here's another gorgeous image of preparatory school students. This one is from 1949, again taken at the front of Laycock House, and the boys are all dressed up because they're performing in the Christmas pageant, which was an annual production at the end of the school year. Chapter 12 is about the development of community values through the house system, the torch ceremony, and the influence of certain long-serving staff, some of whom we've already been talking about. Chapter 13 is related to Chapter 12, how traditions were formed, history actively preserved, and how support networks were created through important groups such as the Old Carey Grammarians Association, the School Council, and parent groups. Chapter 14 looks at outdoor education, including, of course, the development of Toonalook. Now, this is a more modern photograph of Lyle Hall, but it was originally constructed in 1973 to house the dining room and the kitchen. We have in the archives a cache of dozens of slides donated by Ken Lyle, all of Toonalook's construction in the late 1960s and the earliest camps from 1967 to the early 1970s. They're being digitised right now as we speak, and a small selection will be published for the first time in the book. Chapter 15 charts the journey to co-education, which started in 1979. And here we have the girls' uniform designs from 1979, a beautiful colour sketch which we'll include in the book. The topic of co-education gained considerable traction when several staff members, especially librarian Molly MacDonald, asked the headmaster Gerard Kramer to add it to the staff conference being planned for October 1975. He agreed, advised the school council, and forewarned Strathcona's principal, Ken Lyle, that it was a topic of discussion. Carey then invited Strathcona's senior representatives to a meeting to gauge the appetite for a combined co-educational future. The meeting agreed that an amalgamation was the most practical and economic solution, and that it could be done by placing all prep and Year 1 students at Strathcona, Years 2 to 6 at Carey's junior school, Years 7 to 9 at Strathcona, and Years 10 to 12 at Carey at a senior school. But Strathcona quickly dropped out of consideration. Girls' schools fees were then considerably lower than at boys' schools because female teachers were paid much less. The new fee scale in an amalgamated school would have imposed a dramatic rise in the cost of schooling for Strathcona's families. At the staff conference in 1975, teachers generated the momentum for Carey to pursue co-education on its own terms rather than through amalgamation. Gerard Kramer had assigned staff members to convene working parties to explore in advance and present their findings on each conference topic, and Molly MacDonald convened the working party on co-education. Before the conference, it had visited several co-educational schools, and so it presented compelling arguments to their colleagues. Of the 74 staff members at the conference, 69 voted in favour of Carey becoming co-educational. School Council decided that it should start slowly and girls enrol only in Forms 11 and 12. And so they did. And here is the first group of Form 11 girls who enrolled in 1979. And here is the first group of Form 12 girls who enrolled in 1979 as well. So moving on to Chapter 16, it covers the physical demands of the APS, in particular the development of bullying and other sporting infrastructure. As you know, the Bulleen Sports Complex opened in 1962 on 33 acres. It cost £150,000 to develop, plus the land purchase. And here we have one of the best photographs of the opening day of Bulleen. You can see everyone arriving in their gorgeous 1950s and 60s cars and hats and coats, going over to the pavilion ready for the opening ceremony. Now, one of my the most interesting parts of my research about Bulleen that I found was that Headmaster Gerard Kramer proposed to School Council in 1966 that the entire school site, the entire school should be moved from Kew to Bulleen. Class sizes were too big. He'd run out of classrooms. Enrolments then had numbered 1,200. And he was feeling the pressure of keeping up with the other APS schools and the facilities that they needed. So planning commenced for this to move the whole school to Bulleen, but because it was on a floodplain, it was deemed to be too risky. And so it was. And here we have a photograph of the flood that tore through Melbourne in 1971 and trapped Harry Mort in the caretaker's flat at the top of the pavilion. And you can see the pavilion just at the back of the photograph there. You can see how deep the water got. It's absolutely amazing. Chapter 17 takes up where sport left off in Chapter 6. And for today, I just wanted to show you 6 of my favourite photographs of various sporting pursuits. This is the under 15 gymnastics champions team in 1958 with coach Phil Rye. This is the first APS cricket premiership team in 1963 with coach John Sykes, and I just left the names down at the bottom of the photograph there for you in case you recognise any of them. But all of these photographs, of course, will have full captions in the book, and you'll be able to pick people out when you get your copy. This photograph is of the head of the river on the Barwon, probably in about 1964. I've selected it not because it was a head of the river winning year for Carey, but because it's a stunning panoramic shot, which shows the number of people all along the banks of the river, plus the number of cars there. It was an enormous event in those days. This is another wonderful picture. House cross-country event in 1968, wading across the Yarra during the cross-country run. Here is the basketball grand final in 1970, which, yes, Carey did win. And here is the girls' premier tennis team in 1985 with coach John Glasson. So moving on to Chapter 18, that's going to be all about the performing arts. Now, some of you will have sung in Robert Rosen's choir, and here he is with some of the choir members in 1977. Some of you will have played in George Dobson's band, and here is the band playing outside in 1968, possibly at a school fete by the look of the people sitting around in the background having picnics and so forth. And some of you may have had piano lessons with Dorothy Gladell. Now, Miss Gladell also taught me piano in the 1970s from her home, so I was so excited when I found that she was Carey's piano teacher for over 50 years. The lighting crew and theatre workshop students allowed students to take on all the backstage roles at Carey for the musicals especially, but for other events, but especially for the musicals, which started in 1965. This photo shows Rob Grant up on the lighting tower that the boys made in 1975 to be at the very back of the hall to light the school play. It's pretty amazing. 4 musicals were produced by choir master and English teacher Warwick Taylor. Salad Days was the first in 1965, followed by 3 musicals in combination with Strathcona. The Boyfriend in 1966, and here are some cast members from that. The Sentimental Bloke in 1967, and The Mikado in 1968. Now, for complicated reasons, which you'll have to read about in the book, the annual production of senior school musicals did not recommence until 1985. Chapter 19 covers all of Carey's other activities outside the classroom, especially its unique offerings, such as the Aboriginal Scholarship Committee, which worked from 1960 to raise money for a scholarship to enable an Aboriginal boy to attend Carey. Vincent Law was the first from 1963 to 1966. Other schools had very short-lived Aboriginal scholarship committees in the 1960s, and few achieved their aims. Carey's was unique, not the least because it ran continuously from 1960 to 1973. And wonderfully, we have the handwritten minute book in the archives of all of the meetings, plus other records associated with this important group. Some of you will have participated in that committee. Others will have joined the Aero Club. It's a junior school club where you made model planes and model spaceships and so forth. Some of you joined the SRC, and here It is from 1972, with in the front row sitting Arthur Sandel and Gerard Kramer. And some of you made films, and this is where my promise of helicopters comes in. With the guidance of documentary filmmaker Barry Merton, filmmaking was revived in 1972 with the aim of making a documentary of Carey for its 50th anniversary. At first, the school commissioned him to make it, but happily they agreed to his proposal that he guide students to do it while at the same time introduce a filmmaking class. So a small group of students, particularly Tim Smart and Andrew Jones, became captivated by the project and immersed themselves in it during 1972 and 1973. They wrote the script, learned how to use Barry Merton's equipment, and were even given a small office and later a key to the school to be able to shoot scenes in the grounds or corridors using a motorcycle to transport the camera. So even if the students' lack of attention to their formal subjects didn't raise teachers' eyebrows, riding a motorcycle around the school certainly did. They also hired a helicopter to film aerial shots. The helicopter came from J-Row Helicopters in Moorabbin, and here it is, landing on Sandal Oval with Andrew Jones on board, holding the camera, guiding the pilot, who apparently navigated using a Melway on his lap. The film itself has been digitised and is one of the archive's most significant treasures, and hopefully we'll be able to see some of it during the centenary year. Now, one of the most significant sources I look for in all school archives when I'm embarking on a history project is student newspapers. Carey has a huge stash of those, and I've read them all. There were newspapers published from 1960 all the way through until 1978. And they provide a fascinating window into school life and also the big issues which prompted rage or interest among teenagers. Torchbearer was the first one from 1960 to 1962. Teachbearer, published only once in 1963, was Torchbearer's successor, and it was a deliberately light-hearted alternative. The next student newspaper was called Carey Chronic from 1964. It presented serious articles on defence, the need for conscription, what the Crusaders were doing, a review of the school play, and a book review of The Ugly American, which was a highly controversial political novel published in 1958. And here we have a photograph from the 1960s of a student journalist in the Carey Chronic office putting it together on the typewriter. The newspaper also included annual Gallup polls. Student journalists questioned fellow students, usually hundreds of them, on a wide range of topics. And the very first poll in 1964 revealed that 80% of boys favoured co-education, surprise, surprise. 19% smoked regularly, out of school of course, and 70% believed in God. The 1965 poll suggested that around 3/4 of the students supported Australia's role in the Vietnam War, and over 2/3 supported military conscription. These views aligned, in general, with those of most Christian denominations in Australia, for which the alternative, perceived to be the spread of communism, was unconscionable. In 1967's poll, additional questions revealed the demographics of these future voters. The majority indicated they would vote Liberal, and of those, most were from Baptist or Presbyterian families. Nexus was the next student newspaper and continued to be published until 1978. In it, some senior students began to express quite different views about the Vietnam War and support for the moratoriums. Around 20 senior boys from Carey attended the moratorium march in the city on the 30th of June in 1970, and some students attended another march in 1971. What really interested me too was that 5 issues of Nexus were produced that year, and each sold out its 400+ print run, which is very impressive. As students found their voice, they continued to protest on a range of public and more private issues which could all generally be linked to the ideal of democracy that might embrace change faster than the pace of schools and governments. And this was common to many schools at the time. For example, school rules about long hair and compulsory sport were the main topics in the early 1970s. Advertisements and articles encouraged others to resist authority because your hair is your own affair, and Jesus and Einstein wore long hair. The pressure resulted in the formation, as some of you might remember, in 1971 of the Hair Committee as a subcommittee of the SRC. Gerard Kramer appointed Warwick Taylor to adjudicate on any case referred to him about long hair. And perhaps because he wore his own bushy golden hair down to the end of his collar and vibrant red shirts, I'm told, his decisions were accepted by most students. Apartheid also dominated the agenda of 1971 when protests against the South African government erupted in Australia during the tour of the Springboks rugby team. In 1972, Tim Noble ran a Gallup poll which revealed split student opinion on the merit of compulsory sport and compulsory attendance at the Head of the River and the APS athletic sports. And it also recorded that a majority of students wanted school uniform wearing to be optional. So 3 of the last 4 chapters look at the school's history from 1989, when the Donvale campus opened, to the present day, including the school's response to the pandemic, of course. Before I finish, I'd like to mention chapter 21, which looks at the changing expression of Christianity at Carey from 1971, the year in which the chapel opened, followed by Alan Wright's departure in 1972. And historically, I see that as a watershed period for both of those reasons, and I'll go into all of that in the book. A chapel had first been planned in 1955. It kept slipping down the list of financial priorities. It was supposed to be constructed next to the hall in bricks to match, and the school council even purchased the bricks in advance and stored them at the school. The traditional design then in the 1950s echoed those at other Melbourne schools, chapels that were influenced by English public school architecture, a rectangular nave, small transepts and neo-Gothic windows. But a new design, very radical, in 1960, placed the chapel on top of a swimming pool. That wasn't built either. As you know, Cecil and Graham Lyons designed the chapel that we have today according to Alan Wright's vision, and its pyramid roof sits on the top of the Barkers Road hill, and we can see it for miles around. Trevor D'Ambrosio, OCG 1972, has deposited in the archives a really valuable selection of his own black and white photographs taken of various people and activities around the school in the late 60s and early 70s. And I was incredibly excited when I first saw these high quality images because, for example, there was a series of the construction of the chapel. I don't believe they've been published, and so you're the very first people to see them. And yes, I will put a couple of these in the book. So here's the steel frame, and just at the bottom of the screen, you can see one person climbing up one bit of the steel and the other person sort of standing there with his arms up. I don't know if they're using any form of security equipment, safety equipment, but it's the most remarkable picture, all the better for being in black and white. And as is this photograph, shows them actually roofing the chapel. So also in the book, there'll be lists of school captains, Meeks winners, juices, and those sorts of things. I just wanted to mention to you that the real challenge of this project, aside from working on it during a pandemic, has been deciding what to leave out. With such a fascinating history, a school archives of such depth and breadth, the wonderful history survey material which many of you contributed to in 2019, all of the wonderful oral history interviews that the Carey Heritage Committee has done in the last 20 years, plus the ones that I did. There's a lot to look at, but it's very important to balance the level of detail in a book like this with telling a story and also being as inclusive as possible of a range of school activities, while along the way noting the first time things occurred and the unique things that distinguish Carey. So inevitably, some people and events will be left out, and I apologise in advance for that. But there will be a huge index, and it will include the names of every person in every photograph, if we know them. Now, to finish, I wanted to show you a few final illustrative selections for the book. Here is Year 12 in 1956. I just think this is such a smart photo. You all look so grown up and very well turned out. Now, this is a picture from the 1970s with people you will recognise too. We have on the left Frank Tyson, teacher and cricket coach, David Lord, teacher and cricket coach, Graham Yallop, former student and later captain of Australia's cricket team, and Mick Boys, teacher and cricket coach. One of my favourite photographs of Drac Wilkinson, who taught some of you science between 1948 and 1961. And there's the bell telling all you science students to go to your next class. This is another photograph taken by Trevor D'Ambrosio of the school tour to New Guinea in 1969, which is one of the very first overseas tours undertaken by any Carey students. And finally, this is the gorgeous key that was cut especially for the ceremony in 1925 when Annie Mellor, whose son Alfred was a foundation student, turned the lock of Laycock House to open it as the new boarding house, which served the boarders until boarding ceased in 1951. So, to conclude, I will now reveal the book title, and you are the very first group of Carey people to know it, outside the Carey Centenary Book Committee, of course, who has read the book. So here it is, Torchbearers, A Centenary History of Carey Baptist Grammar School. I hope you approve of that. I hope you enjoyed looking at the pictures, and thank you very much for listening.
Okay. So thank you, Helen. That I think we can all agree was a very insightful and nostalgic sneak peek into Carey's history book, The Torchbearers, and obviously what it will look like in in 2023 when it's all available to us. And no doubt for everybody who was watching today, I would imagine it's brought back some amazing memories. So I hope you enjoyed that. For those who don't know me, I'm actually Katie Hunt. I'm Carey's Alumni and Community Manager. I'd like to thank you all for logging in. I think we had over 160 registered guests today, as far away as London, Perth, America. And so I guess what that demonstrates is that, you know, these opportunities to go online are really valuable. And although it was preferable that we'd all be here today in person, it's given others opportunities to engage and connect with Carey. So it's something that we might look into moving forward, but certainly next year we hope to hold the 40+ reunion in person and bigger and better than ever. So that will be, and yeah, it's wonderful. So in terms of the book, I'm sure most of you have got questions about the book, and we weren't able to do questions today due to the format, and I would also assume you're wondering how you can get a copy of the book. So what we're going to do shortly after this is we're going to send you an email which will actually give you details on how to reserve a copy, and we'll also send you a link to this recording so that you can watch it again or potentially share it with your friends if you want to do that as well. So we'll send that email out to you this afternoon. So again, I'd like to thank you, Helen. That was just incredible. I love the puppets. I'm really looking forward to seeing the book myself. Looking forward to sharing the book with you all early in 2023. And thank you, Julianne Brandon, our Director of Community Engagement, for introducing you, Helen. And I guess enjoy the rest of your day. And I really look forward to seeing you all in person in 2022 at Carey or wherever it might be. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed that event. Thanks.